This lecture covers the period 1945 through the 1950s. The focus is on America's quest for post-war security. Now, you would think America wouldn't have so many security needs given that World War II was over. That wasn't the case. This period experienced two important destabilizing elements. First, the unknowns associated with entering the nuclear age that began with America's detonation of the atomic bomb in 1945. Second, an emerging clash that would have worldwide implications, a clash that concerned ideas about how the world should be ordered and how power should be structured. On the one side would be Western democracies wedded to a capitalist system. On the other side would be communist regimes that employed a totalitarian operational system. These destabilizing factors forced the world into an unsettled situation. That unsettled situation would ultimately be labeled the Cold War. I'm going to begin by taking you back into World War II to give you a sense of how fearful Americans had become over the course of the war. The American government fed that fear through a propaganda campaign illustrated here by a set of posters. The next slide also contains posters in a similar vein. What these posters tell us is that in the American mind, the war was an existential fight for existence. The fear was high that we would lose the war unless we committed 100% to the war effort. So there was a selling job going on, and fear was the tool used to sell the war. Everyone was always afraid. Everyone always needed to be vigilant or we wouldn't win the war. My favorite poster is the one on the left. Even the most mundane of activities was connected to winning the war. If you drove alone, it was as though you were aiding the enemy. The leaders of the three largest forces within the Allied coalition met together 3 times. That would be Winston Churchill, Franklin Roosevelt, and Joseph Stalin. Although Churchill and FDR were friends, the two countries did not always agree on strategy and tactics. But the two of them were in agreement that they did not trust Joseph Stalin and the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union only entered the war in 1941 on the Allied side after Hitler broke a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union and invaded that country. The first meeting between the three was held mid-war. The big question was where to open a second front. And here you have an example where the United States and Great Britain disagreed. The US and Soviet Union wanted a Western European invasion. Ultimately, that was Normandy, whereas England had preferred an Eastern and Southeastern European second front in the Balkans. The second meeting of the Big Three took place in February 1945 at Yalta, a resort town on the Black Sea in present-day Crimea. At the time, or before World War II, it had been a favorite summer vacation destination for people from the Soviet Union. This conference focused mainly on post-war planning. The anticipation was that Germany could not stand much longer. It was in the planning for after the war that big differences began to show between the three nations. There was common agreement that an international organization of all nations would be created after the war. That will end up being the United Nations. It was also agreed that the Russians moving west from the eastern side of Germany and the Allies, England and American troops with French support, moving into Germany from the west would jointly occupy a defeated Germany. The three powers did not agree about what to do with the defeated Germany. The U.S. position was that it should be reconstructed and left to govern itself ultimately. The British position was agnostic, not sure what would be the best solution, and the Russians wanted to break it up and create spheres of influence for Russia and the West. They didn't agree on that, nor did they agree what to do with the rest of Europe. Now, Europe is occupied by the military, by troops. Eastern Europe occupied by Soviet troops, Western Europe occupied by the coalition of British, American, and French troops. They agreed to disagree at the meeting. In hindsight, many believe that FDR surrendered too much control of the European map to the Soviet Union after the end of the war. If you look at the image here, you will see a very frail FDR who will die just a few months later. He's covered in a cloak, but if you take a look at his hands, they're palsied, they are spasming, his face is drawn, and he's lost a great deal of weight. So many argue that he wasn't capable of negotiating toe-to-toe with either Stalin or Churchill at this meeting. At the third meeting of the Big Three in Potsdam, Germany, Harry S. Truman had replaced FDR. Much of what the Soviet Union had demanded at Yalta had come to pass. Germany was divided. The Soviets occupied the eastern half of the country, with Western Allied troops in the western portion of the country. The Russian army occupied Eastern Europe and showed no signs of leaving. Despite Western pressure, Stalin resisted allowing the countries to hold elections and create their own governments. Truman, for his part, wasn't forthcoming about America's success at developing an atomic bomb. He had actually received information during the Potsdam Conference that the United States had successfully detonated a test bomb back in the United States. He chose not to share that information with the Soviet Union. This is a good time to remind you of the development of the atomic bomb, for its detonation opened the world to the nuclear age. Going forward, the world would be concerned with the implications of atomic technology, and a fear would hang over the world of nuclear holocaust. This fear would inform governments' foreign policy and its use of the military after the war. Remember, the Manhattan Project began in 1939 after Albert Einstein and other scientists had warned President Roosevelt that Germany was trying to develop such a bomb. The United States mastered the technology, tested it in July of 1945, used it in August of 1945 to hasten the end of the war. But there were issues that remained after the war itself ended. America at first had sole ownership of atomic technology. The question early on was, should she share that on the world stage or should she hold it back? Her initial decision would be to hold it back. Ultimately, the Soviet Union on their own would master that same technology, and America would have to revisit what her global nuclear policy would be. There was also a corollary, and this was something that many scientists who understood nuclear technology pushed immediately after the end of the war, that nuclear devastation was so horrific that it compelled the world's powers to disarm unilaterally, to ensure that there would be no nuclear holocaust. The world's powers refused that call. These three terms help you understand where the world is in 1946 and what happens going forward. Iron Curtain gives you a visual sense of the division that hardens in Europe. That division had begun during the war when the Soviet troops occupied Eastern Europe and the Allied troops of England, United States, and France occupied Western Europe. That occupation, that influence, hardens at the end of the war, to the point that Churchill describes Europe in 1946 as being divided by an iron curtain, where nothing passes through. Containment is the way we describe America's reaction to the Soviet threat immediately after World War II. The first reaction is that the Western powers must contain the Soviets, prevent any further expansion in Europe and other places around the globe. The Cold War comes to represent the conflict going forward. War signifying that it will be of great length, and cold because there never really is a battlefield confrontation between the main players. The war is fought on covert grounds. The war is fought by dominating parts of the world and having influence. The war is fought sometimes by proxies. There can be localized conflicts in which the great powers back one or the other side, but you will not see America take the battlefield against the Soviet Union directly at any time during the Cold War. So how does the United States actually go about containing Soviet expansion? First, you lay out your position in a policy statement. That's the Truman Doctrine of 1947. Then you begin to construct different strategies that are designed to bring countries closer to the West and build obstacles to the Soviets gaining influence in those countries. The first strategy is an economic one. The Marshall Plan offered $13 billion to all countries in Europe to help rebuilding the infrastructure and economy of those countries. Remember, Europe was completely devastated at the end of the war. Most of the countries had been bombed into oblivion. 16 Western nations took advantage of this. This built close alliances between the United States and those countries economically. The United States would also, going forward, pursue a more formal alliance strategy, creating organizations of countries designed to build bridges and to ensure mutual protection. I'll talk more about that later. There will also be what we call surveillance strategies, where covert units are situated in countries in Europe and around the world to monitor and prevent the increase of Soviet influence and later Chinese influence. Finally, there's also the hardware strategy, the idea that you have to keep up militarily, you have to be at the cutting edge to prevent your opponent from provoking a war. This is a defensive strategy, the hardware strategy. The national government expanded and strengthened its security apparatus. The 1947 National Security Act broadly increased executive power to collect information, coordinate foreign policy, and military policy. The military branches were joined together in a new Department of Defense, the Secretary of Defense having cabinet-level rank. A National Security Council was created that would report directly to the President and advise the President on foreign and military policy. The head of the National Security Council would also sit in the President's cabinet. The CIA, or Central Intelligence Agency, was created to collect information, mainly covertly, on foreign intelligence and military issues. It could also, on a limited basis, be authorized to undertake operations secretly in foreign locations on behalf of U.S. goals. All of this translated into an increase in military spending after World War II. Finally, in 1948, the draft is reinstituted. This meant that every eligible adult male would potentially serve time in the military, even though the United States was technically at a time of peace. One of the more famous draftees of the early 1950s would be Elvis Presley. In 1948, the Soviets moved to tighten their control of Eastern Europe. Early in the year, the Soviets backed a coup, toppling a Western-leaning government in Czechoslovakia. Later in the year, Joseph Stalin demanded that the Western Allies relinquish the city of Berlin. Now, the city of Berlin was in the eastern half of Germany that the Soviets had occupied since the end of World War II. But the city itself was of such symbolic value that the Western Allies had divided the city with the Soviets, each of them occupying a zone. So the city was occupied by the Soviets, the Americans, the French, and the English. It was now that Stalin wanted total control of the city of Berlin. When Truman refused, Stalin cut off all means of access into the city: roadways, railways, airport. In response, Truman initiated the Berlin Airlift. For 10 months, every day, American airships flew over the city, dropping needed supplies on for the Allied sectors. The supplies included flour, tinned goods, and even candy for the children. After 10 months, Stalin admitted defeat and reopened the roadways and railways to the city. The city would remain occupied jointly going forward. This joint occupation would have implications down the road in other events during the Cold War. As for Germany itself, it would remain divided going forward. Actually, two separate countries would be created: a West Germany, the Federal Republic of Germany, which was allied with the West, and East Germany, or the Democratic Republic of Germany, which was a satellite state of the Soviet Union. Another outcome of the Berlin Airlift was the U.S. realizing that it would benefit from a formal alliance system that connected the Western European democracies together and joined them to certain Western Hemisphere powers. Created in 1949, NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, included these nations in the beginning: the United States, Canada, Great Britain, Portugal, the Netherlands, Belgium, Italy, France, Luxembourg, Iceland, Denmark, and Norway. Over time, other countries would be added to the NATO alliance. The Soviet Union, in response, joined together the Eastern European countries under its influence and created with them the Warsaw Pact in 1955. The Cold War got more complicated and expanded when, in 1949, Communist Chinese forces succeeded in gaining control of the entire mainland of China, forcing their opponents, the nationalist Chinese, onto the island of Taiwan. Now, this civil war had actually begun back in 1927, but it had been suspended during the Japanese invasion and World War II. In 1945, Communist Chinese controlled only about a quarter of the mainland, but within 4 years had been able to take control of the entire country of China. This sparked fear in the West, fear of a global communist conspiracy, the spread of communist ideology around the world. This forced the Cold War vision to expand, no longer concentrating just on Europe. This expansion was reflected in a document produced by the National Security Council in 1950. NSC 68 committed the U.S. to leading the struggle against communism worldwide. The implications of this were twofold. One, the U.S. would spend an enormous amount of money building up its military capacity. And two, the U.S. made the strategic decision to help Japan develop as a democracy that could stand as a buffer against communist Chinese aggression. So this is the beginning of the revival of Japan and the close alliance that Japan and the United States would end up forging by the end of the century. An actual military conflict breaks out on the Korean Peninsula in 1950. At the end of World War II, Korea was jointly occupied, the northern portion by the Soviet Union until 1949, and the southern portion by the Western Allies. Each side oversaw the establishment of governments that were more friendly either to the Soviet side or the Western side. The initial expectation that the peninsula would be joined in a single government ultimately didn't happen, and we enter 1950 with a divided peninsula. It's here that we experience what's known as a proxy war. The fighting will break out when North Korean forces invade South Korea. But Western powers and communist powers will come to the aid of the governments friendly to them, and the conflict will escalate. In the case of South Korea, a UN resolution will authorize the Western nations to put together a rescue force to repel the North Korean incursion. The North Koreans are and have been backed by the Soviet Union. By October 1950, the UN forces under MacArthur had successfully pushed the North Korean invaders back above the borderline, the 38th parallel, essentially establishing the previous status quo and fulfilling the parameters of the policy of containment. But here MacArthur took matters into his own hands and escalated the conflict without a mandate from Washington. He took his troops northward across the 38th parallel into North Korea proper. This alarmed the communist Chinese, who were watching events on the peninsula with great attention. It convinced the Chinese communists to come to the aid of the North Koreans to prevent what they feared would be an invasion of communist China proper. For his part, MacArthur had let it be known that he was supportive of an invasion of communist China and even of the use of nuclear weapons to triumph over the communist Chinese. Truman could not let this stand. In April of 1951, he flew to where MacArthur was and fired him as commander of the troops. This also initiated a 2-year period of talks between the protagonists in the war. In 1953, a final peace accord was signed that basically established the boundaries that had existed prior to 1950s. The peninsula continues to remain divided. American troops continues to be stationed in Korea at the 38th parallel. The events on the peninsula convinced the U.S. that an alliance system for Southeast Asia would also be of benefit, and so the Southeast Asian Treaty Alliance is created. The member nations there were the United States, Great Britain, France, Pakistan, Thailand, Philippines, Australia, and New Zealand. This particular proxy war frightened citizens around the world because it was opening the door to a potential hot war between the major powers. It was avoided in this case, but tensions remained high going forward. Dwight Eisenhower won the presidency in 1952. He was a candidate who had conveyed a sense of strength to the American people. He'd been the Allied commander of the European theater during World War II. He'd been at the helm of NATO when it was first created in 1949, Upon his retirement from the military, he briefly served as president of Columbia University. He presented not only a strong image, but one that suggested a more moderate, less aggressive pursuit of the Cold War. He used softer language. He did not engage in big military conflicts like on the Korean Peninsula. And this is something I'm going to talk about later, the domestic hunt for communists. But just remember that during his presidency, he will soften some of the rhetoric associated with hunting communists domestically. Image was one thing, action was another. Eisenhower oversaw the expansion of America's nuclear arsenal. In 1952, the U.S. developed a more powerful atomic bomb, the hydrogen bomb. The U.S. also developed delivery mechanisms. The ICBM missile, Intercontinental Ballistic Missile, was capable of carrying nuclear weapons across continental boundaries. Now, Eisenhower softened the reality of more devastating technology by saying it was to be not used, but to deter our enemies from using any nuclear technology they might have. The policy was known as MAD, or Mutually Assured Destruction. If I mutually assure my ability to destroy you, and you mutually assure your ability to destroy me, then it is more likely that neither of us will want to use our capacities. The Eisenhower administration did rely relatively heavily on the CIA, the covert intel arm of the military. He also authorized covert operations that interfered with the internal politics of smaller developing countries around the world. Even though these interventions were deemed in America's interest to generate regimes that would be friendly to Western ideas and would be anti-communist, there were some unintended consequences. The interference by an outside party would be resented by the population in these countries. America would develop a negative reputation in some areas of the world.